Welcome to Columbia Business School, the very center of business. Welcome to the next level of you. The Columbia MBA is more than just advancing your career. This is about honing your unique leadership style, bringing your visions to reality, and delivering them to the world. You will be the leader you want to be. You will be able to walk into a room, any room, and solve. Welcome to New York, the global business hub, where startups get their start, business thrives, and game-changing strategy gets put into play. You will have direct access to today's influencers, the entrepreneurs of Silicon Alley, the wizards of Wall Street, the trendsetters of Fashion Avenue, the agents of change. Welcome to a network, a family of over 42,000 alumni. Let the collaboration begin. This is not a sit and learn environment. This is grab the reins and lead. You belong here.
Welcome.
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 Welcome. Welcome.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Welcome to
2021
Columbia
China Business Conference
2021
哥伦比亚大学中国
商业论坛。
期待您的到来，
期待您的到來，
期待您的參與，
期待你嘅參與，
期待您的参与，
期待您的參與。
期待你的参与。
Hello everyone, I am Vivi Ouyang from Columbia Business School. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 13th Annual Columbia China Business Conference. The conference, organized by the Greater China Society of Columbia Business School, it's one of the most influential China-related business conferences in North America. The conference was founded in 2008 with a vision to enhance the international community's understanding of China's rapidly evolving business and economic environment. This year's conference is themed Navigating Uncharted Waters, Discuss, Discover, Decode. It aims to provide a meaningful platform for dialogues on key opportunities and the challenges associated with doing business with and in China, especially in light of the current US-China dynamics and the long-lasting impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. During the four-day conference, we will focus our discussion across a wide range of economic sectors, including finance, technology, consumer, healthcare, and many more. So now it's my great honor to introduce Dean Costis McLaren of Columbia Business School to deliver opening remarks and officially kick off the conference. Welcome.
All right. Hello and welcome to the 13th Annual Columbia China Business Conference. This conference, as we just heard, was established in 2008 and is organized and sponsored by the Greater China Society of Columbia Business School. It is a forum to understand China's rapidly evolving business and economic environment and a platform for dialogue on key opportunities and challenges associated with doing business in China. The conference is one part of a long-standing interest that Columbia Business School has in learning about the economic, business, and social landscape of China. The Chief Institute for Global Business is the hub of international activity at the school, and its China Business Initiative provides a platform for engaging in discussions among academics, practitioners, and policymakers, and of course, our students. Through programming such as the Lulu Chao Wang Senior Visiting Scholar Program, research publications in Chasing Global Insights, and various partnerships and opportunities for student travel and curriculum, the China Business Institute oversees China-related resources to the school. Switching topics a little bit, 2 years ago, almost to the date, I spent for the first time about a week visiting Shenzhen. This was not my first visit to China, but it was the first time in this part of the country, and I had an opportunity to visit with some of the area's leading technology firms, innovation and entrepreneurship hubs, spent time in the new university that was being set up there, and I also spent the entire time I was there without being able to pay with physical currency or credit cards for any transaction, small or large, in my day-to-day life. I'll return to that in a bit. The United States and China are the world's two largest economies, and they have been closely linked for 4 decades now. And during that time, China has experienced a tremendous economic transformation driven by a dramatic push into manufacturing and exports. It has also been accompanied through a wave of urbanization. 600 million people moved into urban centers in that period of time, many of whom experiencing increased economic prosperity. This has ushered now China's next transformation over this past decade, first into an economy that to a growing degree depends on internal consumption, and second, into one that focuses on technology, innovation, and its own push into services. Throughout that time, change, disruption, rapid progress, and innovation is what I've experienced through all of my trips to China, but was most apparent in my latest visit to Shenzhen. This latest transformation is simultaneously interesting and necessary after the economic success of the past decades. It is also challenging. I want to pivot for a brief moment into education, talk a little bit about the school's mission, which is to train future global business leaders. We find now that it is strategically important to deepen our curricular exposure for our students and our faculty into the Chinese economy, its regulations, and to explore and expose innovations that have come out of China. Examples that come to mind that are near to my own interests are from integrated supply chains that can connect manufacturers all the way to the end consumers, fintech and cashless economies, and the use of blockchains and digital currencies. The last decade has also brought to the fore tension in the relation between the two nations, and it is really in events like the one organized over the next couple of days where we hope to consider ways in which competition and cooperation can coexist, foster innovation, economic activity, and importantly, address vexing global problems, including climate change. The latter being a challenge that would require collaboration and coordination. And to this point, this year, the conference theme is Navigating Uncharted Waters, Discuss, Discover, and Decode. Over the next few days, you will hear from faculty and industry leaders in finance, technology, and retail, including University Trustee Li Lu, founder and chairman of Himalaya Capital, Wei Christensen's son, co-CEO of Asia Pacific and CEO of China for Morgan Stanley, and my colleague, Professor Bruce Greenwald, and Lulu Wang, CEO of Tupelo Capital Management, and a member of the Columbia Business School Board of Overseers. They will lead discussions that address questions about the future of Chinese businesses, drivers of China's future growth, and offer us an understanding of these opportunities and their possible future economic and societal impact. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our first panel. So this is going to be a fireside chat about the outlook of globalization in China. And it will feature Columbia University Professor Joe Stiglitz and Chen-Ying Ye, who is a professor and former dean of School of Economics and Management at Tsinghua University. So welcome again. I hope you will enjoy this year's conference. Thank you.
Live streaming from Columbia Business School in New York City, my name is Tian Yu. Welcome to the first session of the Columbia China Business Conference. In this segment, we're honored to have with us Professor Joseph Stiglitz and Professor Qian-Ying Yi on a discussion on the future of globalization and China. Professor Stiglitz is an important figure in policymaking in the United States and around the world. He's a recipient of the 2001 Nobel Prize in Economics for his research on asymmetric information. He's a former chief economist of the World Bank and a former chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. He currently teaches at Columbia University. Professor Qian-Ying Yi is known for his research in transition economics and China's economic policies. Professor Qian held the deanship of the School of Economics and Management at Tsinghua University in between 2006 and 2018. During this time, he has led transformational reform at the school and was instrumental in grooming future business leaders for China. Professor Qian currently teaches at Tsinghua University. Professor Stiglitz and Professor Qian's personal friendship and research collaboration trace back over 30 years. At this moment of global travel difficulties, Columbia Business School is very fortunate to have this pair of good friends and academic leaders conversing across the Pacific Ocean. From New York City and Beijing, Professor Stiglitz and Professor Qian, please.
Hello, Joe. Hi. So good to see you online.
Nice to see you.
I always remember our travel together in 1992 to Shenzhen and Guangzhou, almost 30 years ago. That was really a fun trip.
And very interesting. We really felt the sense of growth that the Pearl River Delta was going through.
That's right. That's right. So now 30 years later, we're going to discuss issues on globalization and China. So I'm so delighted to join the conversation with you today.
Great.
Let's start from the US. The largest and the most advanced economy in the world has huge implications for globalization. My first question is about short-term policy issues. The US has implemented a range of fiscal and monetary policies in dealing with the pandemic, including the $1.9 trillion package and the near zero federal funds rate. So can you share us your thoughts on these policy moves? Are they necessary? Will they be effective?
I'm very enthusiastic about these policy moves. I think they were necessary. I think they will be effective. The downturn that has been experienced in the United States and elsewhere has been historic. And the sense of vulnerability of so many of our citizens is very apparent. So it is, you might say, both a measure to help those who've been very badly hurt by this, but also to revive the economy. So it's in a way very interesting. It's reviving the economy from the bottom and middle up. And so it's not only the quantity of the support, it's the design of the support that I really applaud. For instance, one set of provisions will have the effect of reducing childhood poverty, which has been a terrible problem. About 20% of American children grow up in poverty. It will reduce that childhood poverty by about half in 1 year. I mean, that's astounding what it's achieving. Now, the concern on the part of some commentators, I'm sure you've seen it, Larry Summers, is that it is too big, that it will lead to inflation. Larry said something to the effect of the kind you haven't seen for a very long time. I'm not worried. And let me tell you why. First, we live in a global economy. We were talking here about globalization. And there are ample excess supply of most goods around the world. So we don't have to rely on our own production capacity. We can help the rest of the world recover. And so I don't think prices are going to increase. Secondly, the fact that the rest of the world is not recovering so well means that our exports will probably be weaker than they would be otherwise. And that will also be a dampener on our economy. Thirdly, if it turns out that there are any inflationary pressures, we have ample room to raise interest rates. I think the zero interest rate policy that has been with us and world for the last dozen years is really distorts capital markets. No one would say the scarcity value of capital is zero. And moreover, when you have interest rates that low, it distorts the pricing of risk. You get this compression of risk and people take excessive risk. There's a behavioral economics, finance theory of the search for yield. So it really does distort capital markets. And finally, we have a tax system in which the average tax rate is too low for meeting the collective needs of our society, and the structure of the taxes is not good. It's not sufficiently progressive. It doesn't address issues of climate change. Everybody recognizes, most people recognize the weaknesses in our tax system, but there's a hesitancy to address them as long as the economy remains weak. So if the economy were to face this any strong inflationary pressures, we could dampen it by raising taxes in ways that would actually strengthen the economy.
That's very interesting insights. And I know that the package is very popular in the US, and among economists, there are different opinions, of course. As you said, Larry Summers has a concern over the magnitude of this package. Mainly, he said that the gap, the GDP gap, is not as big to warrant this size, and he worried about inflation. And you made a good point. Number one, that there's excess supply in the world, so that's the price pressure may not be that big. Second, we have the U.S. has the policy instruments to deal with that. That's all these very good points. Now, additional concern, also arguments, say, for example, Olivia Blanchard also argue about the multiplier effect. Do you see the multiplier effect is big enough?
Oh, I mean, one of the things that we saw in the period of the recovery from the Great Recession is that there are significant multipliers. And they're likely to be more significant in the package that Biden has put forward because it's aimed at the bottom. One of the very interesting outcomes of the research that was done in a very granular way during the COVID-19 was that it showed that the people at the bottom spent all the money that they got, that you could see the day they got the check, they went out and the money got spent. So that multiplier is very large. On the other hand, at the top, the multiplier has been very weak. The savings rate in the United States reached record levels at the top. The average savings rate, which is normally close to zero, very different from China's, soared in the United States to 25% in the second quarter. It's now down to a lower level, like 15%, but still markedly lower than it's been historically. So yes, I think there are going to be multiplier effects, but as I say, even with those multiplier effects, the fact that there's this excess supply in the world, the fact that our exports will be more muted because of the weak global economy, and the fact that we have these other instruments available. And I should also add the fact that today we have technology that allows us to monitor the economy much better than we used to. It used to be we waited until we got the quarterly data, and then it was already out of date. But now we can scrape the internet, we get real-time data, so we can assess in real time much better what is going on.
Another concern is not just the $1.9 trillion package, but there are more coming up. The Biden administration just proposed this $2.3 trillion infrastructure. There may be more to come. So therefore, the cumulative effect of this big expansion may have bigger effect on the economy, the pressure. How do you respond to that?
Most of that is going to be paid for, admittedly over a longer period of time, 15 years. And we know with a balanced budget multiplier, even if it's fully paid for, it can stimulate the economy. But again, I respond back to the fact that there's this global excess supply. We have tools. And there's one more tool that's relevant for these new infrastructure, R&D, public investments. And that is, there's likely to be flexibility in the spending. We don't have to spend it at any particular time. What President Biden has done is to say, we have real deficiencies in our economy. We need to use the phrase that I keep using, we have to build back better. We don't want to go back to where we were in January 2020. And that's going to take some public spending. And how we time that, the problems have been festering for 40 years since Ronald Reagan. So we're not going to correct them overnight, but it's very important that we begin the work in correcting these very big deficiencies.
Yes, talking about the longer term effect, what's your take on the recent proposed infrastructure plan, $2.3 trillion plan? Is this once in a generation, or is this not big enough? So what's your opinion on this plan?
Yeah, well, you have to remember that it's not just infrastructure. It's a very broad public investment. It's an investment program. And so it's an investment program that includes, for instance, R&D. One of the things, I should emphasize, a lot of people don't think of R&D as investment, but of course, we as researchers do think of this as an investment in the future. It's the most important source of economic growth, much more important than capital accumulation or roads. So, and the returns on R&D are very large. Public R&D is very large. Just think of the internet. Think of what the investments in renewable energy and what that's done in bringing down the cost of renewable energy. So you want to think about this as a very broad program and recognize that as a percentage of GDP, we are much lower than we were during President Eisenhower in the 50s. And the importance of R&D in an innovation economy is greater. So no matter how you look at it, there is a huge deficiency. So in my mind, the question is it enough? And,
that's right.
And here, I have to say, that's politics. You have to get it through Congress. We have a Congress that is gerrymandered, where it doesn't represent adequately the distribution of sentiment in the country. Probably 60-70% of Americans would like more infrastructure spending, would like more support for investments in education. But unfortunately, the way we have our gerrymandered Congress and our distortions in our Senate with more disproportionate weight to rural states, we have to deal with that political reality and bring on board, you might say, the more cautious senators. And so I think what we will get is probably as much as one can get in the current political environment.
You are quite right. I think the 2.3 trillion looks big, but it's over 8 years. So on average, only $300 billion a year. For economy, $24 trillion a year. So that's small.
And so, taking account the deficiencies in our infrastructure, the deficiencies in our educational system, in international rankings done by the PISA test, we typically do very mediocre. Shanghai does at the very top, and it says that we ought to be spending more.
Yeah, but I understand that if you ask an American the question whether we need to spend more on infrastructure, the answer is yes. But on the other hand, there is the other side of the balance sheet. That is, how do you finance that? So you are an expert on tax and other public economics issues. So the Biden administration proposed to finance this infrastructure through the increase of taxes, in particular corporate income tax. So that politics comes in. You want to raise taxes? That's a difficult sell. So as you said, we have to face reality. The reality is the US economy, unlike 30 or 40 or 20, even 20 years ago, is very polarized. And people like to have more infrastructure investment. They don't want to pay more taxes. So that's the issue that public economics or political economy have to deal with that. So what's your take?
So dealing with the, as you say, the politics is the political economy is really difficult. But let me talk about the economics of it, the analytics of it, what the evidence and theory says. The criticism, the concern is that raising the corporate income tax will slow down growth, and we will be all worse off as a result. So yes, we'll be benefiting from the infrastructure, but the damage from the higher taxes will more than offset the benefit from the infrastructure. That's totally wrong. And let me try to explain why. And these are topics, as you say, I've been working on, for almost a half a century. And one of the, I modestly say, important papers I wrote on this, I published in 1973, where I explained that the corporate income tax does not reduce investment. And the reason is very simple. You can deduct as an expense your interest payments, your depreciation. In fact, in the recent law, you could deduct the whole cost of the investment. So what that means is the tax is a tax on pure profits. The returns are reduced in proportion to the tax, but the costs are reduced in proportion to the tax. And so both sides are affected roughly the same. And so the marginal return is essentially unaffected. And if you want evidence of that, there actually is ample evidence. The most dramatic example was 2017, when we lowered the corporate income tax from 28% to 21%, from 35% to 21%. And investment didn't go up really at all. What happened? Well, it's what you predicted, what I predicted would happen. Share buybacks and dividends went up. Share buybacks alone went up to $1 trillion. So the money, the extra money the corporations got, it didn't change the calculus of how much investment they should do. It only changed what they had available to pay to their rich shareholders. There was a really interesting study that was done in Australia by a colleague of mine, Andrew Charlton, where the big thing these days is trying to do clean econometrics with clean identification, so you can really identify the effects. And they had you might say, a poorly designed tax where firms at a certain size had a jump in their tax rate. So you had what is called a discretion discontinuity. You could see whether investment for firms that were below that threshold, just below it, and firms that were just above it, so firms that are almost identical, was there any effect of the change in the tax on their investment? The answer was no.
No.
So I am not worried about either investment or growth. In fact, if you look at the details of the proposal by Biden, it has a structure which actually encourages investment in the United States. So this is, of course, a very big issue in globalization. Where does the investment occur? And it's designed to encourage more investment in the United States, in contrast to what happened in 2017, where there wasn't any significant increase in that allocation to the United States. One more really important thing, I want to just mention that very briefly,
sure,
is that the Secretary Yellen, who you may know was my student, one of my first students when I was teaching at Yale, has joined support from Europe and elsewhere for a global minimum tax, corporate minimum tax. So corporations can't search the world for a place to avoid or evade taxes.
Yes, that's actually my next question. That the common concern is about competition in the globalization, in the globalized world. That is, the capital seeks higher return and lower taxes. They can go elsewhere, for example, to Europe, to China, to India, to other places. So that may add additional constraint to the research, to the study we have to deal with. So you said that it may have a international agreement on the minimum tax. That's a good idea. Will that be you think that's feasible or doable?
Yes. Yeah, I've been pushing for that for a long time. It stops this race to the bottom, which hurts countries all over the world, obviously, especially developing countries, emerging markets. But no one wins except those are the very rich people who own these big corporations. So I've been involved in some of those discussions. I'm part of a independent commission on reform in the international multinational tax system, which has been pushing for this very strongly. And there is actually a lot of support for this. I've talked to European parliaments, in the US Congress. So yes, I think, and if the US and the EU agree on it, it doesn't matter what anybody else does. It's going to be de facto. They'll have to design it to close some of the loopholes of people trying to vertically disintegrate, but we know how that's done and we can stop it. So I'm actually very optimistic that we may be on the verge of really stopping what has been something that has really undermined what I view as really one of the ugliest aspects of globalization, and it's had such a devastating effect on poorer countries.
Yes, actually, the proposed corporate income tax is 28%. It's midway between 21 and 35. So it's yeah. What you said is that you're not worried about efficiency implications for this corporate income tax or other government policies, but they do have distributional effects. You already implied for that. So that leads to my next question is about inequality. Because infrastructure and inequality are the two major issues in the US economy. And inequality has two sides. It's about fairness. It's also about efficiency. At both sides, we economists, we are the ones to analyze not just fairness issues, but also efficiency issues. You already referred to when you talk about the stimulus package, the effect on the poor people. Now, I know that the Biden administration actually very much concerned about the inequality. The chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, Cecilia Rouse, said that the Biden administration will aggressively reduce inequality and address structural inequalities that impacting productivity. So what are the structural inequalities and how to address them?
Well, one way of thinking about it is the standard models that we teach our students in beginning economics. It has these perfect markets, labor flows freely and efficiently to the place where its productivity is highest. So there's no discrimination, no such thing as market power, no corporate power, no discussion of bargaining power. Well, the reality is that's not the way labor markets work. There is discrimination against minorities, discrimination against women, glass ceiling. That means a lot of people aren't able to rise to the position that reflects their abilities. Corresponds to another structural impediment in education. Education in the United States, unfortunately, opportunities are related to the income and education of your parents. The net effect of this is that a young American's life prospects are very dependent on the income and education of his parents. And that obviously means that people are not living up to their real potential. There are other structural impediments in mobility, people moving from one place to another. So that was exposed in the aftermath of the 2016 election, where people saw very vividly the differing standards of living in different parts of the country. And that fed into the politics of the moment. And finally, we have a structural problem of market power. Too much corporate power, too much power in the hands of CEOs, too little bargaining power on the part of workers. And this also distorts the way the labor market works. So those are the key, I think, structural factors that have to be addressed if we're going to make inroads into inequality.
So those issues cannot be addressed alone through macroeconomic policies, have to be dealt with through a variety of other policies, less macro, more micro, income policies, public social policies, and even regulatory policy. So the whole range of policy issues that should be brought back. So I think this is also the area you have been very concerned about in the last 50 years or more than 50 years.
Yeah, absolutely. But let me make one point. The only time in our country when we brought into the labor force many of the marginalized groups were when the macroeconomic economy was very tight, when we got the unemployment rate very low. And those periods are periods in which there's the people at the bottom have done relatively well. So I see the macro and the micro working very strongly together. And you have to have both parts of this to really address the huge inequalities that we have here in the United States.
For all our discussions so far, we discussed about the stimulus plan, the infrastructure plan, tax reform, inequality. For all of this, there is a general issue underlying all of the above is the changing role of the government in the economy. In the years after 1980, the general tendency in the US, in the world, is to reduce the role of the government, they increase the role of the market, such as deregulation, lower taxes, etc. Do you see right now the pendulum actually now begins to swing back in the direction of more government involvement in the market? Do you see that happening?
Very, very much so, and for two obvious reasons. One is, you might say, evidence. We've had 40 years of the Reagan-Thatcher experiment. It hasn't worked. Growth in the last 2 decades is half of what it was in the 50s and 60s before the Reagan Revolution. So the Reagan Revolution didn't increase growth. It actually led to lower growth. The second is, and it led to more inequality at the same time. The fruits of that growth all went to the top 1%, 10%. People at the bottom actually saw their incomes decline, and people in the middle saw it stagnate. Also, though, economic theory has helped us understand why we need, why the role of the government is so important, why collective action is so important. And that is, we often put it in terms of why markets on their own don't work and don't solve all problems. You know, we live in an innovation economy. Innovation based on research, basic research, is a public good and has to be publicly provided if it's going to be supplied in the right quantity. And you can think of it very abstractly in terms of mathematics and physics, but you can think of it very concretely in terms of the internet or the research that has helped bring on renewable energy. So whatever level you see it, it's really, as we move to an innovation economy, public spending becomes more important for R&D and for education, and as well as the infrastructure that we're talking about before. At the same time, if there are underlying forces creating more inequality, there has to be a larger role of government to curtail that inequality if we're going to get any kind of social cohesion, if we're going to be able to work together. And one of the important insights of the last 20 years is that economies with greater equality perform better. So rather than the big trade-off that people used to talk about, these are really complementary. Finally, the crisis of 2008 and the climate crisis has highlighted the importance of externalities, that markets often don't work well. And 2008, the banking system didn't work well. We know that the market on its own will pollute too much and will we'll all burn with climate change. So we need a government to restrain the excesses of pollution. So both on the negative side, to prevent negative things, and the positive side, to promote things like innovation, to deal with the problems of inequality, a 21st century economy, government's going to have to play a larger role.
At the same time, we know very well that since 1980, China benefited enormously from market liberalization. You have been very, very enthusiastic about China's growth. I remember that you said in 1992 during our tour to Pearl River Delta, you said, oh, this is not growth, this is a super growth. I still remember that you said that. So isn't that the case to show that market liberalization is really a driving force for China's economic growth to a large extent? Of course, the government also played the important role, but the main driving force is the market liberalization in the case of China.
Yeah, so I was just going to add that to the end of my previous remark, which is the issue is getting the right balance between the market and the government. And in China, before 1975, government had too much of a role. And in the United States, under Reagan and the neoliberal policies, governments had too little of a role. And so you have to find that middle ground between the two. And where that is will depend on the circumstances of the country, the stage of development, the history. There's no magic formula. And it's not only quantity, it's what it does. So when it was announced that you were going to make the private sector the leading part of the Chinese economy, my response was, yes, that's partly true. But when I look at China today, not in 1980, but in 2020, what I see is you have to have improvements in access to healthcare, in education, in dealing with the environment. The pollution is just terrible. So these are all things where government's going to have to play a big role. And your own government says innovation and education are absolutely essential. And government is going to have to play an important role in those sectors as well. So finding that right balance is going to be very important. I think, to me, you say it's not only the private sector, but it's what part of the private sector. Encouraging small businesses, I think, is very important in China. And that is, so it's not, the big behemoths, the big corporations are not going to be the real sources of growth, at least in many sectors of the economy, especially as China is moving more to a service sector economy, like the United States has moved to a service sector economy. So that balance is going to have to be thought about over and over again.
So we mentioned several areas that China needs to improve with the help of the government. Actually, last month, China just adopted the 14th five-year plan from 2021 to 2025, and put innovation, science and technology innovation, public health, and many other aspects into focus. So what do you see among all these areas, the single most important thing or the weakness that China needs to deal with today? There are many things, but can you single out one or two most important areas that China needs to deal with?
Well, I think I mentioned, let me mention something on the macro and then something on the micro. One of the concerns that I've had is that China has relied too much on credit for regulating the economy. And over the recent years, it's been engaged in, you might say, a stop-go policy. You put your foot on the accelerator, you see that credit grow too much, you get scared about the excessive leverage, you put your foot on the brake, the economy slows down, you worry about the slowdown, you put your foot back on the accelerator, and this kind of thing has been going on for many years. You manage to continue an average growth rate in spite of what might be looked at like not the best driving, but it's not I think the best way to manage stable, sustainable growth. And I think you have to use other instruments. So I would like to see, and this then help shape the economy to make it a greener economy and to deal with some of the, inequality. You've achieved inequality, a Gini coefficient that's comparable to the United States, but you've done it much faster. It took us a long while to get the level of inequality. You really moved up there very quickly. So it seems to me that those are some of the things that you need to do. And obviously, a healthy economy needs a healthy population. And that means you have to have access to good health care for everybody, not just the better off. And so that's why some version of universal health care, you're a wealthy enough country that you can now afford. Obviously, the level of care is going to reflect the differences in per capita income, but there are countries like Mauritius, much lower standard of living, per capita income, that have been able to provide health care to their citizens in an equitable way.
These are the three very important areas. The first point you made about the credit debt cycle, it worked so far for the longer time period than we economists thought they should. It worked. So there are two views of that. One is every day the government or the economists very concerned about that. They are very nervous about it. But on the other hand, if you look at the implications, actually it worked fairly well so far. Of course, does not guarantee that whether in the future will continue to work. But one argument is that China's debt, mostly domestic debt, is not foreign debt. So also China has basically capital control. Does that actually help to maintain financial stability, even though the debt and credit cycle, as you mentioned, actually has very been big?
Absolutely. I think capital controls do help a lot. And, there's been a lot of discussion over the years about whether China should get rid of those capital controls, weaken those capital controls, especially where some people would like the RMB to become more of a used for international transactions. To me, China still is at the stage of development where those capital controls play a very important role. And if you got rid of them, it would add a lot to, it would risk a lot of instability. So yes, I do think it gives you a lot of extra degrees of freedom.
So China's economy has been very resilient. So we see that. But one of the most serious uncertainty is the U.S.-China relations. These are the two largest economies in the world and trading partners and in many other aspects closely linked. In discussing the U.S.-China relations, generally there are three broad areas. Areas for collaboration, areas for competition, and areas for confrontation. So there are three broad areas. Let's focus on the areas of collaboration. We know that climate change, health, security are the areas that are very often mentioned. In addition to these two areas, what other areas do you see are likely that to be more collaborative between China and the U.S.?
Well, I think one of there are a whole set of issues associated with, you might say, the global economic architecture. We are, as you said, the two largest countries, and we therefore play a very important role in defining the rules of that global economic architecture. And we would all like that architecture to be stable. We would all like, I think, to promote the development of the poorer countries of the world. In that sense, you might say, make it fairer. In that sense, it would also contribute to one of the other areas you mentioned, security. So let me just give you two areas where right now I'd like to see that cooperation is important. One of them is happening, and the other one, I think there is more work to be done. And the first is there's been a lot of discussion of the fact that while the United States, as you pointed out, gave a $1.9 trillion stimulus, the poor countries just don't have any resources. The stimulus that they've been able to give is paltry. Depending on how you account, something like $20 per capita. Really, really small. So the IMF has a tool called special drawing rights, and there is now where IMF is on the verge of issuing $650 billion of those special drawing rights that will make a lot of difference for poorer countries. And then the hope is that the countries that don't need them, the advanced countries, and hopefully China, will recycle their SDRs to the poorer countries that really need them. So this is an example of where actually there's been a lot of collaboration. It didn't exist under Trump. Trump vetoed the issuance of SDRs, but Biden has been supporting that. So that's an important area of collaboration. The second area, get related, the poorer countries need fiscal space to recover. But many of the countries are over indebted. And China has become one of the major global creditors. And I've done some studying of the nature of this debt. Very clear to me that some of the countries are going to need a deep debt restructuring. It's going to have to be comprehensive, involving money owed to governments, to the private sector, to China. But it won't succeed unless China participates. Because no one is going to say, I'll give up my claim so that China or a private sector guy can get their claim. It has to be cooperative. And there hasn't yet been success in getting everybody together to collaborate, cooperate in that debt restructuring. So I hope we can work together on that.
So you're saying that all these problems can only be solved within a multilateral global economic architecture or global governance rather than through a bilateral discussion, negotiations. You have to have a new global architecture or governance to do that. This is perhaps what some people call globalization 2.0, in the following sense that in the past 4 decades, that we have a globalization 1.0, but and then the changing nature of the U.S. and China relations seems to brought this version of a globalization to an end. We need a new version of globalization, but that will be built upon a new global governance. But with the tension between China and the U.S., do you think that, are you hopeful that the governments, not just China and the US, but the EU or Japan or many other countries can come together to discuss the issues you just talked about?
Yes, and I think you began by your discussion of the things we have to cooperate, like climate change and global health. So the fact that we're in this lifeboat called the Earth together means we have to learn how to cooperate. And so you imagine the Titanic is going down, you're in a lifeboat, you're with people that you may not like, respect, you may differ. In the end, you all have to row together. So I think the realization that we're all in this together, and that if we cooperate, there are gains to cooperation, is going to be very important, is what makes me optimistic. Now, what I hope it can also be true is that as we recognize the needs for cooperation, we can, you might say, be adults and say openly, discuss our own values and our own views about many things upon which we can disagree. So many Americans are going to emphasize, and I'm one of them, the importance of democracy, human rights. Inside the United States, I'm very vocal, criticizing our discrimination. We talked about it a minute ago. The way our long history of mistreating our minorities, Native Americans, African Americans. These are things we're not proud of. And there's a continuing fight within our country to remedy these problems. It's not been easy. I went down south when I was a student in 1962. I was there in 1963 with Martin Luther King on the March in Washington. So I've been out there fighting for these issues for a very long time. So criticizing my government, my country, and one should expect Americans, Europeans, to speak openly when they see things that are deeply disturbing, not only in their own countries, but also deeply disturbing in other countries.
Sure. And there's clearly need to deal with those issues, have global importance. There is a need for that, climate change, that problem, poor countries' problem, every country has its own problems. But also we need specific mechanisms to bring people together. So what are the basic principles of the new global governance you see that are necessary, that people need to agree on, but different from the last, say, 30 or 40 years? What are can you give us some basic guidelines for this?
Well, I mean, the basic thing is it's going to be a much more multilateral, multipolar system. It's going to be much more collaborative, both among the powers, China, US, Europe, but also between the North and the South, between large countries and small countries. You know, in 1944, we founded the United Nations, in which we gave a lot of voice to very small countries, but also voice to disproportionate voice to the big countries in the Security Council. And it's a difficult institutional framework, but it's actually done a good job in many, many areas. And we ought to recognize it succeeded in getting the beginning of a climate change framework, and succeeded in many ways of peacekeeping, in many places in peacekeeping, UNICEF and protecting children, refugees. So even though it's not a global government, it's brought people together from all over the world to deal with a whole range of common problems, and has really been a big success.
And what are the roles?
I would add to that, the World Bank and the IMF. I've been very critical sometimes of some of these institutions, but one of the things I've been very impressed with, say, the IMF, is how it's changed in response to this kind of global discussion of the problems that we're facing.
Since 1990s, when you were at the World Bank?
Yes.
Big change?
Yes. You just think about the fact that, let me mention three issues. Back then, they were a strong proponent of capital market liberalization.
Yes.
And now the new, what they call institutional view, is much more qualified. Then they didn't talk much about inequality. I did, but they didn't. Now they moved inequality to the top of the agenda. Then they weren't talking about climate change. Now they put climate change at the top of the agenda. All these are issues which fall very squarely within their mandate of being concerned about global financial stability and macroeconomics. But the new, you might say, views of economics have changed it from neoliberalism to a view that where these are much more central.
Sure. You mentioned about education. Education played an important role in economic development, in globalization. Now, when comparing higher education in the US and China, what do you think are the major distinctions between the two systems? We are both working in this industry, so we know higher education. And you visited China's universities many, many times. I believe you are honorary professors of more than a dozen universities in China. So you also you were advisors of Chinese students and such. So what do you see the major distinctions between the two systems, and what do you see the major challenges facing China's higher education in the coming decade?
Let me say the major challenge facing every university, every teacher, is how to teach creativity.
Sure. Can that be taught?
Yes.
But yes, okay.
There's no formula for teaching it. It's more of an apprenticeship system. It's you can instill it, you can inspire it, but there's no formula. But you can create an environment for creativity, thinking freely, thinking critically, and that I view is the major, and not having groupthink, all these are really things that are at the center of successful education in all countries. And I think that that's a common challenge that we all face. A second common challenge that we all face is it's one thing to create 5 or 10 elite universities. China is making a big effort to have 10 universities that are in the global top, 100, or, they're working very hard to, including your university. And we have in the United States, more than proportionate market share of the best universities, and we've been very successful. But a successful education system can't just provide an elite education. It has to educate an entire society. Different education for people of different skills, but it has to address a much broader basis. And I mentioned before that, for instance, our elementary and secondary schools in the United States have failed to succeed, have not succeeded in bringing up that level of education in the vast majority part of the country to a level that we would aspire to. The same thing is true in the universities. I think we've been relatively successful in the United States in having, state universities around the country that are actually excellent. And I hope we can maintain it if we can get continued support and maintain access to it by lowering the tuition and providing funds for people of ordinary means to go to school. China has, I think, an even bigger challenge, partly because you have 5 times the population and you have you might say, a catching up to do. So while you've narrowed the gap, you've been very successful at the top. It's a big challenge to create these quality of universities across the country. And to do that, you're going to need to give the universities a lot more scope for independence than there's been some concern about the extent to which there can be this kind, a lot of independence is given to academic freedom in Tsinghua and Beijing. But the question is that same feeling of autonomy present in universities in other parts of the country? So that to me is a second major challenge. A third, one of the areas that I think the United States has done very well in are small liberal arts college. I feel strongly about that. I went to Amherst College, a small liberal arts college in Massachusetts. I was on the trustees there for 12 years. I think I got a fantastic education, a very critical education where these schools have a disproportionate role in creating original, creative people. The number of Nobel Prize winners out of a very small college is quite large. I mean, one of my colleague at Columbia, Nobel Prize winner in economics, Ned Phelps, went to Amherst as well. So these are small colleges that really cultivate this kind of independent, critical, creative thinking. And that, it's a luxury good, but I think it's an important luxury for society.
Those are very good points. You mentioned that higher education should not only focus on very elite universities. Actually, in China, Ivy League is a magic term. Many parents, their dreams that send students to Ivy League. So the China created its own version called C9. We have one more university, 9 universities. I don't know whether that work or not, but Ivy League remains to be such a dream term for many parents. On the other hand, we don't have liberal arts college at all. You mentioned Amherst. It's amazing that two Columbia Nobel laureates in economics all graduated from Amherst. That's quite amazing. And in China, the idea is the bigger the better. So they want a bigger university and only research oriented, research focused. But liberal arts colleges are very much focusing on education, liberal arts education, creativity, critical thinking, all these things you talk about. Indeed, that's the weak part of the Chinese education. You also mentioned about the secondary education. The Chinese secondary education is strong in some aspect. The students, through technical training, they are very good in test. You mentioned not just Shanghai, I think everywhere in China, but those mainly through rote memory. So at the expense of creativity. So that's the issue recognized by the Chinese educators. But the problem is how to deal about it. We all recognize this. You need critical thinking, you need creativity, you need creative thinking. But it's easy to teach formulas than to teach, for example, economic intuition. I've been teaching principles of economics for many years at Tsinghua. I always want to emphasize intuition. I used my experience with you as examples. Economic intuition is so important, but the students always wonder, how do I learn about it? I know how to solve equations, but I don't know how to develop economic intuitions. Any tips on that? Any suggestions?
I think one of the things that I try to encourage, but this is maybe just the way I think, is think about concrete examples, concrete situations, but then move back and forth between abstract reasoning and the concrete.
Back and forth between the abstract reasoning and concrete cases. Now you develop intuitions.
Yeah, I think so, because with case studies, with studying just cases, you don't grasp what are the underlying things that are driving it. You get just description. But when you see things, you say, well, I want to understand why it is. Then you formulate a mathematical model or a simple model, and you start reasoning. And then you go test it back in the data, not necessarily in an econometric way, but in a way that gives you a feeling for what is actually going on. One of the things that I think helped me a lot was the study I did for the World Bank on the East Asia miracle, where I went around to every one of the countries of East Asia and had lots of discussions on a very simple question: why were you growing so fast? And I asked government, academics, business people, labor leaders, and so I got a sense of views from many different perspectives. People may not be able to articulate it in the way an economist would, but I could take that and then put it into my theories and see if it all makes sense.
So it's crucial to ask why. As you said, you ask why you grow so fast. You have to ask a question of why, not satisfied with the answer. So you just need to ask question. You need to be curious. So curiosity is the very important factor here. So that's probably the general lesson.
I think so.
Yeah. So there are more than 300,000 Chinese students studying in the US, making up about 1/3 of its entire foreign student population. However, the deteriorating US-China relationship and pandemic had put a major strain in this area. How to deal with this tension that between China and the US that not helpful for the Chinese study in the US. So from your perspective, any comments and suggestions?
Yeah, it's a very complex issue, and there's one area that I don't have any answer to. Some of the research is, you might say, at a very advanced level in areas that might be relevant to security or defense or frontier areas. But in most of the areas, I think our perspective should be a more educated citizenry is going to be good for all countries. And with more educated people, we will be able to solve better some of our common problems. So I don't worry. I mean, I don't think we should put any restraints on students coming to the United States to study economics.
And business, economics and business.
And economic business, I think that's, and I think that's very important. That kind of a shared experience is very important for promoting shared understanding. So to me, I think this is the most important aspect of our diplomacy over the long run.
I agree. So what are the roles of the universities to play in this situation? What's your advice to the American or Chinese government or universities on academic exchanges and academic freedom? As a professor, any advice?
As a professor, I believe very strong in academic freedom, and that's absolutely essential. What I think, there's been a long tradition in diplomacy, which is sometimes called track 1.5 or track 2. And that is where when governments negotiate, they have to be tough with each other. That's just the way they do.
That's their job, right?
But when we talk about things, we just want to get a shared understanding. I'm not selling you anything, and you're not selling me anything, and it's not a power relationship. It's just trying to promote common understandings. And it seems to me that that's the kind of thing that we should be doing. Interestingly, this is a view that I've had for a very long time. Back in when I was on the Council of Economic Advisors, when not that many people in the U.S. government had been to China, and I had been there a couple of times. I went, back in 1981 was my first trip.
Wow, 40 years ago, 1981, your first trip to China? Wow.
Yeah, 1981. It was a return visit. We had a meeting with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in the United States in December of 1980. And then in the summer of 1981, I went for several weeks to China. So that was my first visit. And of course, over the years, developed a lot of friendships with people in China. And so I wanted at that time to, with some other good friends like Larry Lau, try to promote dialogues on issues, including even human rights, democracy, just so that we can develop common language and understand what concerns are. It didn't get anywhere. It was too hard. But it seems to me now one is in a stage where there are lots of avenues of interchange between academics in the United States and China and Europe. I'm now engaged in a research project actually with Nick Stern and Zhu Min on climate change and, with a number of other colleagues. So it's a global research project on an issue of global concern, climate change.
Interesting. So you came to China for the first time 1981, 40 years ago. For me, I went to the US. Actually, I went to Columbia University in 1981, also 40 years ago. Oh. So that's quite, it's quite a thing. In the audience today, there are many young Chinese Americans with international experiences, and all of them grew up in a globalized world. They will be the ones leading us towards the future, but they are the most anxious group of the society facing the world, a world of uncertainty. What would you say to them, and what advice do you have for them?
Well, that's a very difficult question. I guess my main advice is continue the dialogue. Continue talking, continue discussing, and particularly for the academics, of course, there's so many problems that we have to solve together that continue collaborating.
Yes, I agree completely with you. So we need more discussions like this and more collaborations. So. Given that this is the 40th anniversary, for you all for your first visit to China, for me also in the US, so this is it's an interesting time and to discuss all this. So the time is up. Any final thought on the globalization, China and the US? Do you have?
Well, I want maybe one more minor comment, which is, the last 4 years was a very difficult period because President Trump saw everything in terms of zero sum. One person's gain is at the expense of another. That is absolutely the wrong way of seeing the world. I think we should look at this as a positive sum that as we said before, we have to collaborate. We have some differences in views in our political system and views on a number of topics. And we shouldn't be shy about hiding those differences. But underneath it all, should be an understanding that because it's positive sum, the gains from enhancing our understandings, our collaboration, our working together can be enormous.
Yes, we economists study particular on positive sum games. So this is our field. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us, and I hope to see you in person very soon.
Yep, looking forward to it.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
I turn to our host.
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz and Professor Qian, for an insightful discussion on globalization in China. And thank you, audience around the world, for your time. On April 7th at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time and 8:30 p.m. Beijing time, we'll be live streaming the second session of this conference titled Outlook, China's Healthcare Industry. Live from Columbia Business School in New York City, good morning and good night.